To dig a little deeper into social Darwinism, we will talk about the two related themes of scarcity and survival of the fittest. We'll talk about these two themes connected to two major representatives of social Darwinism. The first is Robert Malthus. As you can see, he wrote his book, An Essay on the Principle of Population, in 1798. Now, this date is rather remarkable because already in the very late 18th century, Robert Malthus predicted that scarcity on a global scale would only get worse. That is to say, that over time, and in fact, he predicted in the very near future, we will not have enough resources to sustain the world's population. This will mean that scarcity, sooner or later, will lead to death on a massive scale. Epidemics and war might reduce the population, right, by killing off a lot of people, but not enough to correct the population's exponential growth. So he says, well, there might be plagues, there might be influenzas, there might be, like what we're dealing with today, a corona crisis. But even though people die in these crises, in these wars, the correction on the global population is simply not enough. Food supply, he says, increases in a linear fashion, whereas population increases in an exponential fashion. This means, he says, that over time, where those two lines cross, as represented here on the graph, we will have what has become known as a Malthusian catastrophe, where the population grows beyond the capacity of the resources of the planet. We will have starvation, we will have suffering simply because of scarcity. There are not enough resources to keep the population of planet Earth healthy and happy. So, scarcity will lead to death on a massive scale. Preventative measures are in order, according to Robert Malthus. So again, pandemics, war, they will cause a lot of death, but not enough. What more should we do, according to Malthus, in order to reduce the world's population so that the remaining people can be happier and live healthier? Here are a few quotes from that work I mentioned before. The immediate cause, he says, of the increase of population is the excess of the births above deaths. Now, this is rather obvious. If more people are born than die, then of course the population increases. What's more remarkable are then the things he suggests. What should we do? We should encourage abstinence among the poor. That is to say, we should make sure that the poor don't reproduce. They shouldn't have sex. Presumably, at least not the kind of sex that leads to babies. And do not take measures, he says, to prevent their death. Concretely, what does he mean? We should facilitate, instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede, the operations of nature in producing mortality, right? A rather complicated way of simply saying, let nature do its thing. When people get sick, let them die. If we dread the too frequent visitation of the horrid form of famine, starvation, we should sedulously encourage the other forms of destruction which we compel nature to use. So he's saying, look, if you don't want people to go hungry and to die of hunger, right? If you don't want the food supply to run out, you should let nature take its course. That is to say, you should let nature weed out parts of the population in other ways. How? Well, says Malthus, instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits, right? So don't encourage people to have good hygiene. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. We should actually try to get the plague to come back, right? And then have it spread among those poor neighborhoods where people live close together. So, of course, infection is extremely likely. And again, do not encourage hygiene. You can think of all the measures right now people take. Washing their hands. Everybody should be washing their hands. Essentially, Malthus is saying, yeah, some people should wash their hands, but you know what? If you let just a big part of the population not wash their hands, or you don't encourage them to, you don't teach them about hygiene, they're more likely to die, which in the end is a good thing because then there's less people on Earth, and so the people who remain can be happier. Returning to the quote, in the country we should build our villages near stagnant pools and particularly encourage settlements in all marshy and unwholesome situations. Back then, there was still the idea that disease spread through what they called bad air, and the idea that there were places that were bad to live because of the air. Now we would say it's because of the mosquitoes there carrying disease and other bugs like that. But what he's basically saying is let the poor people die because they live close together, they live in unhealthy places, they will infect each other, and keep them kind of ignorant of personal hygiene. So, what is the good news according to Malthus? Population growth and mass death can be prevented if we take the right measures. What should be rather unsettling is those right measures as he sees them, namely allow or actually even encourage the poor, that is to say, the surplus population, to die. Now, this may sound, or I hope it sounds, rather awful. There is just a straight up assumption in Malthus's work that some people are far less important than others, and that if we have to choose, and he thinks we have to choose because the food supply is going to run out soon, if we have to choose, then obviously these inferior people should be sacrificed. The fact that he could write that back then suggests that this idea, surely it was controversial at the time, but I don't think today many people would probably write it down quite that starkly. An interesting comparison in this context is Thanos. This is Thanos, a supervillain from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, hopefully, you've seen the Avengers movies. If not, there's a slight plot spoiler here, but I think it is unavoidable, and really, by now, you should have seen all the Avengers movies. Thanos has a very fancy glove, a gauntlet, as it is called, in which he's put the so-called Infinity Stones. Background is here not important. What is important is that Thanos, with this glove, has the ability to wipe out half of all humankind throughout the universe. He can do this simply by snapping his fingers. So, what is the threat? The threat, and the heroes in the movie are trying to save the universe. They're trying to save the universe by stopping Thanos from killing half of humankind. But Thanos is a very interesting and perhaps somewhat unusual supervillain. Because, yes, he wants to destroy life, but he wants to destroy life in order to make the remaining life better. So, destroying half of humanity would mean, according to him, a halt to famine, to a lot of suffering caused by overpopulation. It would give nature room to breathe, and the people who remain behind, the people who are left behind, would have a better life because there would be fewer of them. So, from a certain perspective, you could say, a sustainability perspective, the Thanos' goal is actually rather noble. Much nobler, at least, than what Malthus is suggesting. Malthus is suggesting let the poor die so the rich can live more comfortably. Thanos, again, fictional hero, well, rather obviously fictional, I think, if you look at him. Thanos will snap his fingers in his special gauntlet, and in doing so, wipe out half of humankind. But half of humankind irrespective of who those people are. So he doesn't pick and choose, simply half, randomly, right? He doesn't know who will live, who will die. Nobody does. Just simply the population will be halved. And in this way, as he puts it, the universe will once again be balanced. Leaving behind for the moment both the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Malthus, if we consider the pandemic from an ecological perspective, from the perspective of sustainability, you could say that there's never been a better time for the planet. Or, well, surely there's been a better time, but not in recent history. There's very little CO2 in the atmosphere. There are clear skies over cities and forests that often are completely obscured by smog. Nature is flourishing now that we, human beings, are staying at home, are driving less, and are just being generally less polluting. Now, this comes, of course, at a huge price. We have to curb our freedom. There is a lot of suffering. But again, it is worth talking about these things. It is worth talking about the effect on sustainability of this crisis, because it brings into sharp relief what we value and what also we can express in the public sphere. What is important? What can you talk about? And oftentimes you get the sense that it is perhaps safer to talk about the economic consequences and how this is really bad for the economy. And this is why some people might say, well, we should open things up again so that the economy can recover. That tends to be a much more common topic of conversation than nature and the environment and the very beneficial effects of the pandemic on those. But returning to our social Darwinists, a very relevant question to ask is who counts as surplus? Because Malthus takes it as a given that the poor are basically redundant. They don't add value to society. They are inferior, an inferior kind of people, and therefore it's not that big a deal to let them die. Now, presumably, if you'd ask the poor that Malthus is talking about, if they consider themselves redundant and surplus, we could probably safely say that they do not agree. Who is actually redundant? Well, if we think about human rights and if we think about human dignity, then nobody is redundant. You have dignity simply by virtue of being human. This is where it's interesting to introduce another social Darwinist, Herbert Spencer. And it is actually Herbert Spencer and not Darwin who introduced the term survival of the fittest. Spencer reads Darwin's work, and based on his reading, he comes up with this term. Now, we already know how to properly understand fitness, but it's really Spencer who has started a long tradition of misinterpretation of this term, misinterpretation at least from a Darwinian perspective.